Hi there, my name is Emmett Smith and I'm a professor at Earlham College where I teach a number of courses in the molecular genetics and biochem area. And today I am going to be talking to you about how I have been able to incorporate 23andMe and discussion of direct-to-consumer genetic testing into my human genetics class. I've had a really great experience doing this, so I'm excited to share with you how I went about doing it and hopefully inspire you to think about ways you can incorporate something like this into your own classrooms. And I'd like to thank ASBMB for accepting this as a poster presentation and also for giving us the opportunity to present our work online. So I'd like to start with a bit of background about the school that I teach in and the course that I have used this 23andMe content in. So I teach at Earlham College, which is a small liberal arts, primarily undergraduate institution. We have about 1,000 students enrolled at any given time. So small school, small courses, and a lot of flexibility in some of the activities and things we are allowed to do because we aren't teaching multiple sections of these courses. And the course that I teach is a 300-level biology course, Human Genetics and Genomics, and we really use a human-focused approach. Obviously here we use a textbook that's a medical text that talks about all these different genetic diseases and explore the relationship between mutations and the cellular and then physical effects of those mutations. And I also like to bring in kind of ethical challenges in the field, particularly medical challenges that we are facing today, because a lot of the students in this class are interested in medicine and so on. And I usually have about 15 to 20 students enrolled in this class. It's offered it's pretty much offered every other year. And I should also point out, I'm not affiliated in any way with 23andMe, so just doing this because I think it's interesting and I think it helps the students learn. So I've taught this course 3 times. The third time I taught it was the first time that I incorporated this 23andMe into the class. I think it was a good decision and I'm gonna attempt to do it in the future. So what are some initial considerations that you might want to think about if you're gonna incorporate 23andMe or some other type of direct-to-consumer genetic test in your classroom? So the first thing, of course, we all are concerned about is, will this help my students learn? So I'm going to go through a few examples to try and answer that question. Do I need IRB consent? And I'm going to talk about the process I used at my institution. How will I, the professor, ensure my students' privacy and safety? That's a pretty big concern for something like this, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can go about keeping your students safe and keeping their information private. Who's going to pay for these tests? They aren't free. Then how will I, the professor, incorporate 23andMe into my class, aka into the content of the course? And I will give you some examples about how I've done that in my class. So let's start with the first consideration. Will this help my students learn? There has not been a ton of literature on this, but there is some, and these 4 citations on the slide here point to yes. I should point out that these were not all done in the undergraduate setting. So you can see there's some PharmD curriculum, medical school curricula, higher level education here, graduate education. However, some studies indicate that it does, in fact, also help improve learning and interest in subject matter in undergraduates as well as graduate students. So the literature points to, yes, this will help my students learn. My student evaluations from the 1 year that I used 23andMe in my course also point to yes. So when students were asked in an open response evaluation, what were the most positive features of this course? And they could have picked anything that we did all semester long. A number of them, so I got 7 total responses, and out of 7, 4 of them chose to highlight 23andMe and direct-to-consumer testing discussions and projects as one of the most positive features of the course. So the first student indicated that seeing their own results helped them broaden their understanding of the subject. The second student indicated that they were able to relate more to the material because of the 23andMe testing. They also were interested in learning about these different companies. We did an activity, which I'll describe later, and the problem of information literacy in the public, which I think is really great that they were able to pick up on that and understand that there's a disconnect a lot of times between people who purchase these kind of tests and maybe the scientific literacy is lacking for them to understand or correctly interpret what they're seeing. Another student said the 23andMe opportunity were both very positive. They had another item in front of that, of course. And then the fourth student mentioned the integration of socio-political discussion, responses to ongoing commentary made by those within the world of genetic information, current genetic diseases was amazing. So they were very happy that we went a little bit outside of the box, outside of the textbook boundaries to engage with some topics that really are challenging the population. So yes, your students will probably be aided in learning if you incorporate some sort of direct-to-consumer genetic test such as 23andMe into your human genetics classroom. So do you need IRB consent? Yes, you do. Because I wasn't doing an experiment, quote unquote, I did not have to go through the full IRB approval process at Earlham, but I did go through an abbreviated IRB approval process and met with the IRB members and had actually really great discussion with them and was able to improve some of the things I was going to be doing in the classroom and got good feedback. So I had a good experience doing that. And you do need to have your IRB give you the green light for using this in class. And so while you're thinking about getting IRB consent, a couple important things to consider are that you need to make the tests optional. You can't force students to do this if they don't want to. You also have to make the testing confidential. It needs to be confidential from other students and from you. You need to make the testing and any discussion that you may or may not have safe for those students. And an important thing that I hadn't thought about too much, but I really enjoyed learning more about was the idea that students have a right not to know. I'm one of those people who wants to know all the answers and everything in a test like this, but I've learned that that opinion is actually a minority opinion, at least among my students, that many of them, if given the option to learn, for example, about if they have the mutated Huntington allele, would not choose to opt in for that information. So it was important to make sure that students have a right not to know. And these things to consider and other ethical considerations can be found in the citation at the bottom of the page here that I highly recommend you go through and read while you're putting together your IRB approval form. So that's a really good link. So yes, you need IRB consent, but you may not have to go through the full process. Okay, so the next thing that we really want to think about, and this ties right into the IRB idea, is how will I, the professor, ensure my students' privacy and safety? So one major way you can do this is keep yourself blinded to which students have opted in. One of the ways that I was able to do this was I ordered tests for everyone who was in my class, and I gave those tests to our lab manager, and the students picked those tests up from the lab manager. So I was never informed which students picked up the tests, how many tests had been taken, or anything like that. They had no contact with me. I had no contact with them while they were getting those tests, and it was completely blind. And they were blinded to each other as well, unless they obviously revealed the information themselves to each other. They wouldn't know which of their classmates had chosen to take the test or not. And so I think that's a really great way to work around the idea of that you want to keep yourself unaware of who has taken the test in your classroom to avoid any potential biases that might creep in. Another great way to make sure your students are safe is to create an informed consent document. There are examples of this on the 23andMe educator portal, and that's where I found the example that I based my own informed consent document off of. But some of the things to think about in an informed consent document are to bring up potential risks that students might encounter. They need to understand that the knowledge that they learn is irrevocable. They're not going to be able to unlearn what they will learn. And they may learn things that they don't anticipate learning. They may encounter strong emotional reactions to that information. And they may learn things surprising about their heritage, their parentage, their ancestry, or find an elevated risk for a certain disease. And they need to be very well aware that they are going to potentially encounter that kind of information. And there are other things in this document that you can find examples of on the 23andMe educator portal that are good to make sure your students are really well aware of before they would opt in. Another thing that I would suggest is going through the 23andMe privacy policy in detail with your students the first week of class before they're allowed to obtain their kits. So obviously, getting results back within one semester, you need to get those kits to the students early, have them send the sample to 23andMe ASAP so that they can get their results back. Usually this takes about a month or so. And so if you have any projects you want to do, just be aware that it's going to take some time for them to get their own personal results in. So I really front loaded this at the beginning of the semester, and the first week we went through this privacy policy. They really enjoyed doing this, actually. The students had a good time digging in, and we went through the nitty-gritty details of that policy, and that was really good for them and helped them frame the exercises that we were going to be doing the rest of the semester. Another thing that's really important is never ask students to share their personal information in class. Never, 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 never. Don't even consider it. It's not going to be safe for your students. It will not keep their data private, so don't do it. One thing you should also make explicit is that there will be no negative repercussions if they opt out. You hopefully won't even know that any of your students opted out, but you want to make it very clear that there's no repercussions. There won't be any grade that's affected by this. Your opinion of them won't change, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And then one thing that I did that I think helped the students as well was to engage a genetic counselor who specialized in direct-to-consumer genetic testing and brought that counselor in, and we had a webinar. You could also bring a counselor in for a class session, and maybe they could do some career advice at the same time. But we engaged this counselor to specifically talk about the direct-to-consumer genetic testing and how you might find certain information out that you have to then deal with and what that might mean. And then I also got permission to share the counselor's information on the course website. So even though 23andMe has a bunch of links to doctors and so on their website, then we were able to have this kind of connection with this counselor. So if any of the students felt like they needed to reach out to someone, they had a link ready and waiting as someone we had talked to in the classroom. So another important thing that you can do to ensure the students' privacy and safety is to be very explicit about what they might learn. So we talked about this already, but it's worth repeating. Be explicit that they might learn things about their ancestry that they were not anticipating. This can actually be pretty tough for some people who learn that they're not from where they thought they were. And what does it mean to embrace a culture that your family has celebrated the traditions of for years and then find out that maybe that's not true? And does that change the relevance of the emotional attachment you have to that culture or not? I think that's a really important thing to think about. Parent-sibling relationship status. So your parents may not be your biological parents and they might not have told you that, or a sibling might be a half sibling or adopted and you might not know. Of course, your parents or siblings might need to be in the database for you to realize that, but it's a serious concern, and that can be very disruptive to certain family dynamics, so it's something to bring up. There are 44 different reports that you currently receive for carrier status in 23andMe, and 13 health predisposition reports, and those include currently on 23andMe late onset Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and selected variants of BRCA1 and 2. So it's really important to talk to the students about what they might learn about their own health and genetic carrier status or predisposition to some of these pretty devastating disorders. Now, it's also important to note you opt in to the Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and BRCA1/2 tests. So even when you get 23andMe, they don't reveal that information to you. You still have to opt into that. So there's a second level of information that you need to agree to before they will show you your predisposition for those disorders, but it's still available. So it's important to go through all of that with the students so that they understand what they're getting into if they opt into this. So who's going to pay for these tests, right? 23andMe provides their Ancestry and Health Kit for about $100 as for an educational purpose, which is half off of the sticker price of $200. So you're gonna have to figure out how you're gonna get that funding. You might use college funds or course fees. Course fees may not be equitable. That's a discussion for another day, but even within one class, some students who would pay the course fee may opt out, and then they'd be paying that money for nothing. And so it's important to think about where that cost is coming from and who it's benefiting. I was fortunate to be able to get a grant to buy the kits from an experiential learning fund that we have at Earlham. And so I would encourage you to seek funding from your institution. Maybe your department has some funds that might be applicable for something like this, or the institution at large might have some funds that you could look for that would be a good alternative to course fees. Okay. So how will I incorporate 23andMe into my class? So there are tons of options and ideas that are out there. Again, the 23andMe educator portal has some of these and other websites as well. And I'm just going to share with you what I've done because that's what I know how to talk about is what I've already done. And I can tell you if I thought it worked or not. So one thing that I did was discuss 23andMe tests when it was relevant to lecture content. Now, I did not discuss results, or I never asked the students to share their results, but I would always inform them if what we were talking about in lecture was something they were either gonna learn or should have learned from their 23andMe test, depending on if they'd already gotten the results back. So some examples here, when we talk about Alzheimer's disease. 23andMe offers a risk assessment of Alzheimer's based on your ApoE mutation. So given now what you know about that gene and its effects on Alzheimer's disease, is this risk assessment fair? And we can go through and talk about how 23andMe looks at the data now that we know what ApoE is doing, all the different variants, the effects on men and women that are different, and so on. So that usually is an interesting discussion for students to start thinking about, and then if I go to my test and opt in, then I know what 23andMe is doing in the background, right? Another interesting discussion is to think about, the older version of 23andMe that did allow people to look at Huntington. So currently you do not see your Huntington allele in 23andMe, but you used to be able to opt in to see that. So after we talk about Huntington disease and talk about the effects that it has on people who are affected, what does that mean to you, the student, if you were to find out you had the allele that had over 60 CAG repeats? How might your life change, right? And have the students bring that personal connection into the classroom. So those are just some examples. Of course, there are many more ways you can incorporate this into your classroom discussion and your lectures. The other thing that I did that I think the students really appreciated as well was to assign a scaffolded direct-to-consumer genetic testing investigation assignment. So this is what I'm going to spend the rest of the this talk talking about is this assignment that we set up and we did, and it ran through the whole semester, and obviously got a little bit more complicated every assignment, and ended up with students presenting posters at our local museum, which was actually really cool. So how do we start? Well, first off, we had personal genome testing in lieu. So as I mentioned before, the very first week of class, we dug right into the details of 23andMe and their privacy policy. We had our genetic counselor attend the class via a webinar. This might be a great time to bring in an alum of your institution if you have a network of alums that are genetic counselors. That might be really cool for your students. And we did this right away at the beginning of class because I wanted my students to be prepared, to be ready for getting this test so they can get the box, send the spit, and get the results back during the semester. And so this was a fun way to kind of begin class because it also makes this really personal link to the material right away. And so it engaged the students on another level than just like, here's the syllabus and here's some lectures starting out. So they were really engaged and in discussion right away. The next thing that I did is to use this fun activity of creating a list of known direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies, assigning 1 or 2 students to each company as a homework assignment, and having them fill out some information about that company. So this image here is the chart completely filled in, but basically you ask them to look up things like, do they have a certification and what kind? Are they CLIA certified or not? Some places aren't. What type of sample do you have to give them? Spit, blood, something else? How much does it cost for one of these tests? Who are the directors? Do they have degrees? Can you even find that information on these websites? What's the clinical validity of these tests, and so on. And so you can see this chart that you end up filling out, and together in class, you come together. Each student will present their specific company. You fill out the chart. It's important every year to update your examples. Some of these businesses will not be around anymore. Some of them are definitely more legitimate than others. And as I've written on the top of this chart, there is some amazing rubbish out there. And the students have a lot of fun being like, what is this? How can people claim to know what wines you're going to prefer based on your genetics? And then, we can get into a discussion of what that means in smell and taste and how that's determined by genes and is that valid or not and all of this. So they have a really good time doing this. And again, they're really getting engaged and having agency in figuring out what's really going on in some of these companies. So I want to point out, I did not invent this activity, which is a really fun activity. It was presented and not presented by me at the ASHG Undergraduate Genetics Education Workshop in 2016, which I attended and totally stole it and use it, and my students love it. So I recommend you use it as well. So then the next thing that I do with this with this activity is to, after we have this discussion of all these different tests, I ask the students to dive a little bit deeper. And we chose to look at Origin, this particular company that gives you different tests, different prices, and claims to be able to predict certain things from those tests. The students really like the superhero test, but they're also interested in things like the fitness and nutrition tests, right? They are like, oh, okay, what can I learn? Is this really legitimate? And I asked them to go and pick a very particular gene that's tested in one of these tests and try and find primary literature on that specific gene to either show that these tests are valid or show that these tests are maybe a bit of a stretch, right? And the students also enjoy that. It gets them into primary literature, but they kind of still feel that agency and ownership of this project. And we're starting to pick apart these direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies and learn a lot more about what you're actually getting behind the fancy packaging and the fun logos, right? So the students enjoy that. Okay, another activity that I've done with the students is to look at the FDA compliance, non-compliance debate. This was, it's getting a little dated now, but it's still interesting to think about how regulation, governmental regulation in the form of the FDA, can impact these companies. Is your genetic information your own? Is it not your own? You can bring that into it. Who gets to tell you what you should and should not know about your own genetics? And so I think this debate is a great way to get into that. And there's 2 articles here that can get you started. And then, you can take it from there and design different types of course discussion or essay responses around these articles. And then the 4th thing that we did that I really enjoyed and the students enjoyed, and I think is a key part of education, particularly in the scientific realm, is to have the students practice sharing their knowledge. This could happen in so many different ways, but we are lucky to have a museum on campus, the Joseph Moore Museum, and we were able to partner with them to allow our students to present infographics at one of the museum events. And so the students presented infographics on 4 topics. One is, what is direct-to-consumer genetic testing? So we were like, how can we inform the public about this? Then what can you learn from company X? So they chose a couple of those companies from that spreadsheet earlier, and some from that were more valid and some that were less valid, and kind of ranked them and said, here's what you learned from, let's say, Vinome versus from Ancestry.com, and why do we trust some of these companies more than others? What should you be aware of when purchasing a direct-to-consumer genetic test? So this kind of goes way back to week 1, where we talked through those privacy statements, the knowledge that you're going to gain. What do you need to know before you opt into one of these tests? And then you can also have, a general overview of DNA, or maybe you could choose a specific disease that you might learn about from one of these companies and present that if you talked about it in class, and so on. So there's a lot of different options here. This went really well for us. Your institution probably has a bunch of different ways that you can engage your students in different activities on campus, presenting to their peers perhaps, or maybe even presenting to the community. So that's a brief summary of how I incorporate 23andMe into my classroom. Thank you for watching this presentation. And please reach out if you're interested, want sources, have questions, want resources, or have any questions. I'd be happy to talk with you or help you figure out how you could also incorporate 23andMe into your classroom. I've had a great experience. The students had a positive experience with it, and hopefully we will be able to do it again. Thank you.